Hello, folks. My name is Bradley J. Welcome to Revolution 250 podcast. Rev 250 is a group dedicated to commemorating the events leading up to the American Revolution. My co-host is Professor Bob Allison of Suffolk University. As I said, I'm Bradley J. And our excellent guest today is Don N. Hagist. Don is the managing editor of the Journal of the American Revolution. He focuses on the British soldier, getting to know the British soldier. His books include The Revolution's Last Men, The Soldiers Behind the Photographs, and he maintains a blog at redcoat76.blogspot.com. Thanks for joining us, Don. Really appreciate it. Professor Allison, why don't you kick things off?
Great. Thanks again for joining us, Don. Thank you, Bradley. Now, Don, I know there are a lot of different reasons men would have served in the British Army. Can you give us some idea about who these men were?
Thanks. And that's a great question to start this off because people, they tend to homogenize soldiers. When you say there was an army of 5,000 men, there's a tendency to just think that they all must be the same somehow. And what I try to focus on in my research is not what all the similarities are, but what the differences are, how diverse the population was. So in terms of joining the army, unfortunately for the 50,000 or so British regular soldiers, the guys in the red coats who were professionals in the British Army, only a very few of them wrote down what their own reasons were for joining the army. So we have to be a little careful about speculating when such a small number actually gave their reasons. But when we look at the reasons, we tend to find that they are not the kinds of things we might guess. For example, there were 2 or 3 of the soldiers who wrote down their reasons said that there was something about their life at home that they couldn't tolerate anymore. For example, a man's father died and his mother remarried, and the young man just couldn't tolerate his stepfather, so he left home. Another guy, his father was a weaver and he wanted his son to take over and follow in the weaving business, and he wanted nothing of that, so he ran away and he joined the army. These are the same kinds of reasons that you can imagine men in their late teens and early 20s leaving home and joining the army today, right? A lot of people trying to look at this analytically will look at employment statistics and things like that and try to infer reasons. But so far, I haven't found a single case of a person who wrote down his reason to join the army to say, I couldn't get a job and it was the best job I could find. We always find reasons that are more associated with what writers at the time called a roving disposition or wanderlust.
Did soldiers get a bump in social status generally from where they were previously?
Did soldiers get a bump in social status? That's a tricky question to answer because it depends on a lot of factors. The soldier certainly joined a well-established professional community. And so in that sense, he got a boost to his position. He might remove a lot of uncertainty from his life. But whether soldiers are liked or disliked depends a great deal on the very specific context they're in, and it often can change with political tides and other tides. So the recruiting literature of the day certainly pushed this idea of improving your status. You're going to be wearing fine clothing probably for the first time in your life, and you're going to learn to walk and carry yourself with the air of a gentleman. Well, if you were a British soldier and you were sent to the western coast of Ireland to enforce anti-smuggling laws, you might not be popular with everyone. If you were a British soldier sent to Boston in 1769 to enforce British policies that the local population disliked, then you might not be seen as somebody of a good social standing. So it's an interesting question, and it's not so simple to answer directly and simply whether it was really a bump in social status. A soldier could improve his education and his economic prospects by joining the army, and again have the stability that a laboring life or an itinerant life might not offer him. But whether society saw him in good standing is quite a different question.
Now, did the soldiers strike up relationships with some of the women they might meet in the American colonies?
Oh, of course they do. And here, context is everything. You send an army over, if you have an army of empire, I'll call it, if you have an army of professional soldiers that are sent overseas to garrison places for extended periods of time, they tend to meet local people, get involved in the local community, and ultimately, yes, meet local women and marry into the community. And we need look no farther than the United States Army in the last 50 years to see the exact same thing going on. There's no great anomaly to this. So yes, when British regiments stayed in a place like Boston before the war, or even garrison cities like Newport, Rhode Island, the city of New York, Charleston, South Carolina, Philadelphia during the Revolution, to some extent, they became integrated in the community, and there were a lot of marriages, both sanctioned and unsanctioned.
I suppose that the wives of the soldiers, like say in Boston, if they went to Boston and married, their social status would depend on a lot of things too. They might be at a bump up or a bump down depending on the community, the small community they were in.
This is exactly right. There's no accounting for love, you know, and I didn't really say that very well, but some women who were in very dire straits might find marrying a soldier was a great thing for their prospects. And in other cases, the daughter of a reasonably well-to-do family falls in love with a redcoat soldier because he does look fine in that uniform and he's from another place and there's an air of mystique about him. And she might leave a comfortable life to go into a relatively difficult life following a soldier.
You write a bit about on your blog about the soldiers we know about who were involved in the Boston Massacre, and I'm just thinking about Private Montgomery and his wife, who seem to have been troublesome neighbors while they were here. She came with him, I believe, from Ireland. Can you talk a little bit more about what we know about those particular guys?
I can, and again, I don't have the data right in front of me to recall, but Private Montgomery, like many soldiers in the British Army, had enlisted in the Army several years before the Boston Massacre happened. This was an era when soldiers joined the Army as their career, not for a 4-year stint or a 2-year hitch or what have you. And soldiers who married had the option, with different kinds of restrictions and parameters, of having their wives accompany them when the Army went overseas. Again, this shouldn't sound like anything strange when we look at professional armies today that go overseas for garrisons or for peacetime duty. Remember, the soldiers who came to Boston were not there to create tension. They were there to maintain peace. So soldiers' wives came with the Army. But yeah, within the Army, there were certainly boisterous characters. We don't know a great deal about the personalities of these people, but some things come out in some of the legal documents that were created around the time of the Boston Massacre. And we find that there was tension between the civilian population and the soldiery and the wives of the soldiers. Now, whether this was because Edward Montgomery and his wife were boisterous people and hard to get along with, or whether the population resented having soldiers among them in the city and made life troublesome for them, it's a lot harder to characterize. So we get some airs of aspects of personalities, but we have to put it carefully in context of why we even have the information.
Last week we talked about the kit of the Minutemen and a little bit about the training. How does that compare to what the British soldiers had for a kit? And as far as the discipline, how were the disciplines different? That's another way to get at the life of the British soldier.
Okay, well, I'm not sure I'm going to try to answer that by comparing to the Minutemen because they're out of my own field of research. I will start by saying you'll never find the word kit used in the 18th century in the way we use it now. But a British soldier received a regular supply of clothing. He received a regimental uniform once a year, and this consisted of the red coat that we're so familiar with its lapels that could button over and its skirts that could unbutton in the rain. It was a very functional garment, even though it seems strange by modern standards. And a pair of breeches and a waistcoat. He was reasonably well clothed. This was fairly durable clothing. And then his company captain was responsible for providing shoes and stockings and shirts as often as they were necessary. So the terminology necessary items comes out in the terminology of the era. So in general, he was fairly well clothed. The soldier did have to pay for this clothing himself out of deductions from his pay. And a lot of writers today will use that as a very, they'll take a very oppressive view of that. Well, the soldier got paid a certain amount of money, but then he had to pay for his own food and clothing through deductions from his pay, and he ended up with very little money. All right, to compare that to a common laborer who just gets paid, but then he has to pay for his own food and clothing out of his own money. And then he might also have to pay for lodging and what have you. So this army system of having the soldier pay for his clothing through deductions from his pay was really just a way of budget management. It wasn't a matter of skimping on how much the soldier earned, so much as saying he earns enough to provide everything he needs, and then somebody else might manage that budget if he can't do it himself. For training, these soldiers began their training within their regiments from the moment they were recruited. They start being taught how to march, how to stand like a soldier, different aspects of hygiene that are highly necessary for an army. If you're going to have a large group of men living in close quarters, they need to be clean. And even though germ theory wasn't known in the 18th century, the correlation between cleanliness and health was very well understood. So a young recruit immediately starts learning how to take care of himself and how to march like a soldier and what have you. Eventually, when he's reasonably skilled at these things, he gets issued a firelock, a musket, and he starts learning how to march with that, how to march in formation with other soldiers. By the time a man like Kilroy or Montgomery come to Boston, they may have been having this kind of training for 2, 3, 5, 10 years. Even during wartime, British recruits went to places called depots and were trained often for anywhere from 6 months to 2 years before being sent to America. Is this getting at the discipline question a little bit?
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a whole lot to it here. In general, these soldiers are being taught from a document called a Manual of Arms, and historical reenactors rely heavily on this because it shows how to hold a musket in all different positions. But all this training was foundational so that by the time the soldier joined a regiment and the regiment started training to do actual fighting, it became adaptable. You learn a Manual of Arms not so much because that's the only way you will ever hold a musket, but so that where to hold this musket becomes second nature. So if you have to do something like climb over a stone wall, you'll just very naturally know how to hold that weapon in a way that it's completely under your control, even if you're doing something very unusual with it that you've never done before. So the training and discipline ingrain a bunch of fundamentals in the soldier that ultimately make him highly adaptable to whatever kinds of conditions he needs to work under.
We're with Don Hagist, who is the managing editor of the Journal of the American Revolution and so much more, in case you forgot, and Bob Allison, professor at Suffolk University. Bob, it's your turn.
Okay. Don, as Bradley said, you're also the managing editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, which is an interesting project. Can you tell us a little bit more about the journal and how people can access it?
Sure. The Journal of the American Revolution is what we call a web magazine. So it publishes articles on a daily basis. We actually do a new piece 4 days of the week, and then typically publish a podcast on the 5th day. And occasionally we'll put something up on weekends as well. But we try to maintain the same quality in our web articles as you would find if you found them published in a scholarly journal. But at the same time, have a writing style that we call a business casual approach to history. We want impeccably factual information, but we want it to be readable. So the articles tend to run anywhere between 1,000 and 6,000 words. We rely very heavily on having good primary source material to back up anything we say. So we're not looking for opinion pieces. We want just the facts. And it's absolutely free on the web at allthingsliberty.com, just as one word. Or if you search for Journal of the American Revolution, you'll find it. The project was started back in 2013 by a fellow named Todd Enderlich, who had published a fairly successful book, but recognized that a print publication, starting a new print publication today isn't a very good business proposition. So he looked for a different way to do it and put it on the web, and the journal has become quite popular and quite successful.
Yes. Who writes for the journal?
That's a great question. And who writes for the journal? The answer is anybody who wants to, who is capable of sending us an article that is relevant to the American Revolution and the founding era. So we go from about 1765 to about 1805 in our scope. It has to be pertinent to the events of the founding of the United States of America and the American Revolution. So we're not just looking about anything to do with the time period. But the most important thing is it has to be based on primary sources. It has to be a factual account of something that we're really confident actually did happen in the way that it happened. We're very focused on dispelling a lot of the mythology that has grown out of the American Revolution, a lot of the stories that came out in the 1900s and the early 20th century or early 21st century. There's a lot of mythology and a lot of aggrandizement of the American Revolution. And we want to get away from all that. We just want to say, here's the story that we actually know. Here's what we can be certain of.
What are some examples of myths about the British soldiers that actual research shows not to be accurate?
Well, one of the ones straight off the bat is conscription or impressment, or there's a lot of different terms for it, but the idea that soldiers were forced to join the army. There was actually a plaque at the Bunker Hill National Monument that has since been changed, fortunately, but it said that men were dragged off their farm fields and pushed into the army. And that simply wasn't so. Something that is widely not recognized is that during the time of the American Revolution, the British Army was an all-volunteer force of professional soldiers. Now, there was one exception to that during the middle of the war after France joined the war. So it wasn't because of America fighting, it was because all of a sudden France is in the war in 1778. The British government tried a press act where there was conscription of soldiers. It was very limited in scope and very focused on how it was supposed to work. And it went very badly because two populations hated the Press Act. One was the people who were liable to be pressed, but the other organization that hated the Press Act was the Army itself. Because if you have an army of professional volunteer soldiers who are doing this as their career, and then suddenly you say, oh, and here's a bunch of new guys who don't want to be here, and they have to be right alongside you, and you have to work with them. And remember, they don't want to be here. That just never works very well. So the British Army did not conscript soldiers, except for during a very limited 18-month period during the war. Very, very few pressed men actually served in America. So it wasn't a relevant part of how to characterize the British Army during the American Revolution. And yet there's a persistent dogma about that.
Now, related to that, I don't know if you've looked at all into the Germans who fought. That's something of is that a different situation for the Hessians and the Brunswickers?
That's a topic for a different scholar than I. Yeah, I don't
Okay.
study that in enough detail to be able to answer that question.
Okay, thanks. I do have a question about one of your more recent books. Speaking of primary sources, Wives, Slaves, and Servant Girls, which really looks at that interesting story. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and that project?
Sure, that book, I'm going to talk about it maybe from a different perspective than you were expecting here. I put that book together as a resource because I found that people researching, particularly researching women and their roles during the 18th century and the material culture of women during this time period, often would seize on small amounts of information and try to do big things with it, which is okay when you only have small amounts of information. But we needed a much bigger data set. So for example, I would see someone say, here's a description of a woman's clothing in 1742, and look at all the important things. And here's another one from 1787. Now let's compare these and contrast. And I said, well, this is clothing, this is material culture. These things change a great deal between 1742 and 1787. So how can we get a better data set? I was using newspapers for my research on soldiers, looking for deserter ads, descriptions of people who left contractual agreements or other kinds of employment bondage, advertisements for soldiers who deserted. And I also found advertisements for slaves who ran away, for indentured servants who absconded, for spouses who left their marriages. And they're all very fascinating because you get little descriptions of individual people and people from a class who you often would never find any information about at all had they not absconded from their obligation. So over time, I realized that I had hundreds of these ads about all kinds of people, but in particular about women who ran away. And they were from a very narrow time period, 1770 to 1783, all from America. So I just took a selection of 400 of these ads and put them in a book, really to say, again, look at the diversity rather than try to look at all these advertisements and say, what can we generalize and do statistics and just render averages and means and median. Say, look at the different kinds of people, look at the different kinds of clothing, look at the different kinds of motivations, look at the different situations they were in. And so the real goal was just to provide a very rich data set from a very narrow time period from which then people could do whatever they want in terms of analysis and trying to learn more and dig deeper.
Could you speak a little bit more about the British soldiers' experience in Boston and how they integrated into the community? I'm trying to visualize how many lived in a garrison and had to be 24/7 soldiers. How many were quartered in homes? Did they get to go out at night and have dinner? Did they have to go to certain loyalist bars, or would they show up to pubs in groups, small groups, where there could be anybody and they had to kind of stick together and get, avoid fistfights? What was that whole scene like?
Sure, I think I can describe that in one sentence. Now, there's a lot of question there, and we have to start by recognizing that there were two distinctive periods when British soldiers were in Boston. There was British soldiers in Boston from 1768 until the spring of 1770. And then even though it was still a British colony, there were British soldiers in the area. There weren't really soldiers you'd see in the city again until the summer of 1774. And these dates correlate with British political policies and whatnot, so we won't get too much into that. But once soldiers are in garrison, in 1768, two British regiments landed in Boston. And a regiment at that time, because the size of a regiment varied, but it's good to think of a regiment in 1768 as being about 400 soldiers. The 400 soldiers now have to live in the town, and there's a law called the Quartering Act, which is widely misunderstood, but you can look up the text of the Quartering Act online and find that it was not legal for British soldiers to be quartered in private citizens' homes. So all these soldiers could not be forced to live in houses, or private citizens could not be imposed upon to put soldiers in houses. So the British Army occupied other buildings for barracks, and it was difficult initially to find places to quarter these soldiers. They camped on Boston Common during the fair weather, and that was nice, but in the winter they had to go into other buildings, converted warehouses and other places like that, and quarter together. Officers could take their own private lodgings, and even some soldiers, if they were responsible enough, could rent rooms if they wanted to, but there was no law that allowed soldiers to be for soldiers to be forced to live with private citizens during peacetime. The Quartering Act prohibited that. So right away, a lot of the things we see in popular stories are not accurate. But now we have a population of soldiers. We have about 1,000 soldiers in town, because we've got 2 regiments of about 400 each, plus some officers, plus there's some support functions like artillery and what have you. So figure about 1,000 soldiers in a city with about 4,000 adult males in it. It's a fairly substantial presence. And these soldiers have time off, so they're allowed to get part-time jobs if they want to. Yeah, they're certainly allowed to go into the local shops and taverns and what have you. And sometimes that's quite successful. I mean, sometimes there are no issues, but the population resents the presence of these soldiers. It's seen as a threatening thing. And specifically, it's seen to violate the colonial charters under which these American colonies were established. It said the colonies can provide for their own defense. And then all of a sudden, the British government sends soldiers in to be in among the towns. They're not off defending the frontier. They're in Boston. Why do we need soldiers in Boston? What would a government be trying to do by having soldiers right here in the town among the people? It was seen as very threatening. So straight away now, when a soldier wants to go into a tavern and order a drink, it really depends on who else might be in that tavern and what the attitude of the tavern keeper might be and what have you, whether that's going to be a situation that nobody pays much notice to, or whether it's a situation that's going to cause tension.
Bob, you want to go ahead?
How does recruiting go for the British Army during the war? Are they recruiting people here, back in Britain? Is that, as the war goes on, is that a problem?
It's a good question. Now, but remember, right up until hostilities broke out, we have British soldiers in British colonies, so they can recruit wherever they are. And there were a number of Americans serving in the ranks of the British Army in red coats, among both the officers as well as among the soldiery. Once war breaks out, policies change. We don't recruit, or the British Army doesn't recruit soldiers in America directly in the same way anymore. They start raising regiments of loyalist soldiers. Now, this is something that the British government had done for a long time and continued to do, is raise temporary regiments of soldiers from among local populations wherever the army was. They did this in Gibraltar, they did it in Minorca, they do it in India, they do it in America. The army continues to recruit in Great Britain just as it always has. And so regiments get reinforcements of recruits during the war, but particularly early in the war, much of the time, rather than recruit new soldiers in Great Britain, give them a moderate amount of training, and then send them to America, there's a lot of regiments of the British Army still in Great Britain. So the army does what is called drafting at the time. And this is draft as in pull, like a draft beer or a draft horse. The army transfers regiments, soldiers from regiments in Great Britain to regiments in America. And then the regiments that are in Great Britain recruit more actively because they're not being deployed overseas for a while. So what we see for the regiments in Boston in 1774 and 1775 is they get new recruits, but only about half of the new men they're getting are actual recruits, and the other half are men who were transferred from other regiments. And what this does is ensure that there's a pretty high level of training among the regiments. So in 1774, military buildup starts. We get more troops in Boston, ends up being close to 10,000 by the middle of 1775, but only about 1/6 or fewer of these troops are actually relatively new recruits. In any given regiment, you'll find 80 to 90% of the soldiers have at least 3 years of experience and some 20, 30 years of experience in the Army. And then there's a portion of new guys, but it's not very many. It's not enough to reduce the operational readiness of those regiments.
I have a question that may be more about soldiering in general than the British soldiers, but what is your sense as to how many soldiers, when going into battle, were scared to death, and how many had enough training so they weren't?
That's a great question. And the challenge there is it doesn't really matter what my sense of it is. It really matters what the soldiers were actually doing. And unfortunately, so few soldiers wrote down anything about that topic that it's impossible for me to really just spew out a general answer and say, well, some were this and some were that.
Can you give me a best guess, like 90% were scared, or?
I wouldn't want to make such a guess,
All right.
because if I make that guess, then somebody else will say, oh, that's really what it was.
That's right. And you don't work with
exactly what the
guesses.
Journal of the American Revolution, and exactly what I try to avoid, is
All right.
saying this is
No speculation.
Yeah.
Bob, anything else?
What did you actually have another really interesting book, the photographs of the oldest surviving veterans. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? Because the research you did in that was really quite phenomenal.
Oh, sure, thanks. And that was a great project for me, because I had done a book for West Home Publishing and about British soldiers. And the publisher came to me after that book about British soldiers came out, and he said, here's this book about 6 Americans who served in the Revolution, and then they lived long enough to have their photographs taken. And in 1864, a book was published about those 6 men that included the photographs. And he had a reprint of the book, because it's been reprinted several times. The photographs and the stories of the men have been reprinted over and over. But he said, it seems like this could use a refresh, somebody to look into it and bring it up to date, modernize the history that's in this book to go with these photographs. And I said, sure, I'll do that, because of course, I don't study American soldiers at all, and the British Army is demographically different, and all the research sources that are needed are different. But this was a publisher asking me to write a book, so I said, sure, I'll do that, why not? And as I looked into it, if you look at the original book called The Revolution's Last Men, with a little bit of discernment, you immediately find that some of the things it says about the soldiers in the book are impossible. For example, there's a soldier whose photograph is in the book, and his biography says that he served in the Battle of Brandywine, in the Battle of Bemis Heights, and at the Siege of Fort Stanwix. And if you know about the American Revolution, those things were all happening at the same time in different places. Nobody could have served in all 3 of those. And yet this biography says that, and people just reprint that and reprint that and reprint that without even questioning it. And the book is full of those kinds of things. So I just started looking at who these men really were, looking at primary sources, again, looking for the muster rolls and the orderly books and the pay lists and period newspaper accounts and other sources to find what these men really did. I found that they all had very fascinating stories. There's 6 men who had nothing in common with each other at the time of the Revolution. They just all happened to live long enough to be photographed. They were the last 6 surviving pensioners from the war. To my amazement, I was able to find roughly similar amounts of information about each person, which when you're writing a book is very fortunate. You don't want to have like one really thick chapter and one really thin chapter. I had very good fortune to find enough to say about each person to have a balanced book, but what is said about each one is very different. When I finally put the book together, I divided each chapter about each soldier into 3 separate parts because I didn't want to lose what was written about them in 1864, even though a lot of it wasn't accurate. Some of it was accurate, and it's still historical information. So I found what the soldier really did and what his career actually was like. Then I found and went through their pension depositions that they gave in the 1820s and 1830s. And I just decided to include those verbatim because it's the soldier's own voice. And then I also included everything that was written about them in 1864. So not only is there no loss of information, but you can actually even see a progression of how the memory of the person's service in the war changed and evolved as it got farther and farther from the time it occurred. It ended up being a really fascinating project for me, and I was excited. And I also found several additional photographs of some of these men that hadn't been published before. So that was pretty exciting too.
Before we wrap it up, I want to bring a little attention to your blog, redcoat76.blogspot.com. Tell me a little bit about the September 13th posting and Mary Kitty.
Oh, about Mary Kitty. Yeah, thank you for checking into that one. Yeah, what I like to do with the blog is write little biographical sketches of individuals who are involved in the British Army, the soldiers' wives, and the soldiers' children. It's really, really hard to find information about these people, but with a lot of putting of puzzle pieces, we find it. So Mary Kitty turns up in New York in 1783. The only information we have about her is a deposition she gave before a board of general officers making a claim for money that was owed to her. It was owed to her because she had been married to a British soldier, and a British soldier was paid and received clothing from the army that then he owned, and her husband died. Well, by law, she's married to him. She's entitled to his estate. So she went before the board of officers and said, my husband, when he died, he was owed money from this regiment that he served in for this amount of time, and he was owed clothing from that regiment for that amount of time. And so I'm here to make this claim for it. That's everything we know about her. I was able to confirm in muster rolls about who her husband was and a little bit about how he had served in the army and what happened to him. He was a prisoner of war taken at Saratoga, escaped, rejoined the army, went to Yorktown and died there. But we don't know really anything about Mary Kitty herself when she married her soldier husband. She may have come with him from Great Britain and served in Canada with him and been a prisoner of war with him. Or maybe they met up in New York just before he left for Yorktown and married them. We just don't know, which is a real shame because we know this woman's name and we know she was sensible enough to know exactly what was due to her and how to make the claim for it. And that's everything we know right now about this woman.
Bob, we good?
That's good. Thank you very much, Don.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Folks, I want to remind you that Don is the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution. You can check that out. And many books, including The Revolution's Last Men. Go to Amazon and check them out. And then there's the blog that we just talked about, redcoat76.blogspot.com. Don Hagist, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Bob, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for episode 3 of the Revolution 250 podcast. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.